Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 1995 science fiction thriller 12 Monkeys. Now, 12 Monkeys is based on a short film called La Jetée. And I'm familiar with that film because I watched it for a film studies class in college. And it was interesting, but I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite stories or one of my favorite films. I would honestly say that 12 Monkeys is a better adaptation of that story, even though this is technically, I guess, a remake, because there's just more to this story that is not only more intriguing, but it definitely does a better job with characters. Like La Jetée didn't really give a shit about the characters for the most part. And I get it, it's a short story, and they're not really trying to go that in depth with characterization. And it's more about the concept and the idea, and the whole setup of still photography mixed in with sound and music and dialogue. But 12 Monkeys is just a more compelling overall take on this story for me. It's directed by Terry Gilliam, and I would definitely say this is one of my favorite Terry Gilliam films. He's done some films that I think are a little bit too out there and weird, even for me. Although I'm one of those people that really likes Brazil, and I would say that's probably my favorite Terry Gilliam movie off the top of my head is Brazil. 12 Monkeys would probably be a close second. Um, this is a movie that really exemplifies visually something that I like to call beautiful but ugly. You know, it's a ugly looking film in terms of the color palette, in terms of the production and art design, at least when it comes to the future, the post-apocalyptic future after the virus has ravaged throughout most of humanity, and it looks very grimy. It looks dirty. It's very messy. And despite all the like plastic and all this other sort of stuff to try to make it look sterile or clinical or whatever, it just has this very dirty feel to it. And despite that, though, it doesn't look like it's just a bunch of ugly imagery. It's ugly, but also beautiful in terms of its presentation. It's one of those. It's a very difficult kind of thing to nail, and I think Terry Gilliam is definitely one of the best directors out there who has been able to nail that kind of vision. And 12 Monkeys features some really great direction by Terry Gilliam. He's a very quirky kind of director, and he definitely inserts a lot of those quirks into this film with the way that the camera is sped up at times, or his use of slow-mo, or the way that he decides to move the camera around from scene to scene. There's a good use of pans and zooms and all the other uh, tricks in the book, so to speak, from Terry Gilliam. And he is really a master when it comes to showcasing the inherent beauty of the production design or the art direction. Like, he's a really good director when it comes to that. And 12 Monkeys is another one of his films that really does have some moments where the art direction and the production design really shines, as well as the costume design. And there's some really nice looking visuals in this. When the animals are let loose from the zoo, for instance, that's a really cool shot. When you see Bruce Willis's character go back in time, so anytime that he gets into the time machine, James Cole, it's a very unique kind of approach. It doesn't seem like he directed either scene the same way, and there are some sequences that involve the time machine stuff where it really makes it appear as if it's a very painful and uncomfortable experience. It's not at all what a lot of people look at when it comes to time travel, and other films and other stories. Like time travel seems to be a little bit more desirable or a little bit more fun. This doesn't seem like it's fun. This isn't Back to the Future. Like you aren't getting in a fun ride in a DeLorean. You're in for a very uncomfortable and just unsettling experience. And he's just a director who really does a masterful job with the aesthetic of whatever aesthetic he's choosing for a film. It's one of those things where he really wanted to create a film that really left you uneasy, or definitely made you feel like you were watching something that was honestly definitely separate from your perceived or normal reality. So that's why you have a lot of fantastical sort of bits of direction, like a fisheye lens at one point, or so on, to just really create this very uneasy and almost nightmarish sort of look and feel to the film. Even the sequences that take place during the 90s, even they feel very surreal and very strange, especially the sequences in the mental institution. Um, but yeah, I can't really sing enough praises for Terry Gilliam's direction. Like his direction in this is fantastic. The script is by David Peoples and Janet Peoples, and I don't mind the script. I think the script is relatively solid for the most part. I think the film can be a little hard to follow at times with the different timelines and the jumping back and forth and stuff like that. But it doesn't really get to the point though where it's a complete and total muddled mess of a story. It's still relatively easy to follow, despite some moments where it kind of loses you a little bit along the way. Really, where the script shines for me is not necessarily the futuristic stuff, the post-apocalyptic stuff, or the time travel elements. Really, where it shines is with its characters. I think it really does have some very strong characterization for characters like James Cole or Dr. Catherine Rayleigh or Jeffrey Goins. Um, those three have some really compelling and really well written arcs for each of them. I think the dynamic between James and Catherine is quite unique, because it starts out as one of these sort of things where it's very antagonistic, but then as it goes on, it becomes more of a, not necessarily love story, but kind of in a way. It becomes more of like a tragic uh, union of two people who feel like they were destined to be with one another for whatever reason. Speaking of destiny, I really like the idea of having young James Cole be there at the airport when the older James Cole ultimately meets his heroic demise. Because it's one of those things where James is constantly having these nightmares, and they all take place in this airport, and it's a really nice bit of storytelling to have this foreshadowing actually connect to the plot in a way that isn't just, oh, this is what's going to happen next. Like it's letting you know what potentially could happen, but you really only realize that with hindsight. Otherwise, seeing these dream sequences, they're so fractured and they're so vague that there's really not much that you can really glean from them initially. So I like that it all like adds up together into a really interesting sort of twist. I will say this though, speaking of the twist, I do think it did a good job keeping you off the trail in terms of who the leader of the 12 monkeys is, or who the person is that releases the virus, because it makes you think it's Jeffrey, and does a good job making you think that it actually is him, but then it pulls a swerve, and then it's someone else, and because of a confluence or a series of events, it leads to the virus being unleashed, despite what James and other people are trying to do to prevent it from happening. It's just one of those predestined sort of things, because I think this deals with like the predestination paradox or whatever, something like that. And that makes for an interesting time travel story where you can't alter the past, but you can potentially change the future. And that's why it says like the future is history, because they go back in time, in the future. So, but it's just one of those things, though, where the future is predestined, so the future is already a part of history, and you really can't do anything to change that. But what you could potentially change is the future. And I think maybe you could look at it as like the future is history, is in terms of like this post-apocalyptic future. That's history. It's out of there. If everything goes well. But I don't really think that the writing in the climax was really the best. See, the film was rather smart and clever for the majority of the running time in terms of how it dealt with time travel, how it showcased this post-apocalyptic future, how it showed James Cole and his character, and how he traveled from the future to the 90s. But then it's one of those things where he wasn't always making it there in the most sane fashion. I really love the progression of the story in terms of how each time that he goes back in time, it's different. So it showcases the effect that it has on his mind as well as his body. I like the bit where he gets sent forward in time, but it's one of those things where he's not able to meet up with Catherine until a little bit, honestly, a long while later. So he's living as a homeless guy, and he's dressed in rags, and he just smells like garbage. And that was an interesting dynamic. It's to have that sort of thing happen, where imagine that, like, if you're traveling through time, but you didn't really make it right there when you're supposed to meet up with this person, so you have to wait until you have an opportunity to essentially kidnap this woman, because there's no other way to make this work. And I think that's definitely an interesting dynamic. He's forced to kidnap her, and then it leads to them realizing the reality and the truth of their connection with one another, and how it goes deeper than they both might initially think. And I like how he keeps changing his demeanor and like his mindset each time he goes back in time. So one of the last times that he goes back in time, now he thinks that he's crazy, and he just wants to do whatever he can to stay in this timeline and be sane. And now Catherine is the one that's trying to get him to remember things and getting him to realize that he's not crazy and that he really was from the future. I like that. And I also, speaking of time travel, I also like the bit where he doesn't necessarily make it to the right destination. He winds up in World War I and gets shot, and then he gets sent further ahead in time. So it showed that this time travel process is not an exact science. And that's something you don't see very often in these kind of movies that deal with time travel. So that was something that was really interesting to me. But the climax, when it comes to the real virus killer, so to speak, the psycho who unleashes the virus upon the world, I think it's Dr. Peters. I think that's who it is. Yeah, it's Dr. Peters, played by David Morse. The way that this is written is way too convenient for me. See, I just spent a good chunk talking about how clever and how smart the film is, because I'm leading up to this point where it's no longer as clever or smart as it was for the majority of the running time. It did a good job throwing out this red herring and Brad Pitt's character. It did a good job showcasing all these different facets of time travel and how it can go wrong and how it can affect your mind. And then it showed the growing and intriguing dynamic between Catherine and James. But then you have the real psychopath in Dr. Peters, and he gets through airport security way too easily with these suspicious looking vials. He opens the vial and releases the virus into the air in the airport way too easily, and it just seems like it was just way too convenient for me that he was able to do all of this easily and without that much resistance. It just felt like it was something that seemed far-fetched even for a science fiction film. Like, there had to be more protocols in place. They changed the password because they initially thought that it was going to be Jeffrey and his 12 monkeys that were going to release the virus, but as it turns out, they just wanted to release the animals from the zoo, and because they changed the passwords and they changed the protocol, then they gave the passwords to the real psycho and Dr. Peters, and he used that to take the viruses samples, and now he's going to spread it across the world. But it's just one of those things where it's like, okay, yeah, I know you changed one protocol, but these are like really deadly lethal viruses and like biohazard stuff and bioterrorism kind of things. I would think that there would be more of a failsafe than just, oh, we're just going to give the passwords to this one guy and trust that he's not some kind of crazy psycho. So it's just one of those things where it just felt way too convenient, way too easy. And also the way that he gets through airport security. The airport security guys look like total dumbasses. And then you had the whole stuff too where the cops shoot Bruce Willis's character, and I get why it's set up that way because it's fate and whatever, but I don't know, it didn't really seem like they needed to shoot him. Like, it was one of those things like, do you really have to shoot him? Well, he had a gun, but he wasn't pointing at any of the cops. He was trying to shoot the doctor, and I don't know why no one else in the airport didn't pick up on the fact that this guy was suspicious as hell from the beginning. Because when he's going through security and he's acting all kooky and weird when he's talking about the virus and how it's odorless and there's no smell. It's just one of those things where it just seemed a little too ridiculous for me, even for a science fiction sort of fantasy film dealing with time travel. And then the open ending, which leaves things up to interpretation, that was also a little bit of a letdown for me, because it's one of those things where it's like, oh, it could be an instance where the insurance policy is to save the future. So the lady from the future, she's there, and she takes out the doctor when he when the plane lands later, and takes the virus, the original source of the virus, and takes it to the future, and they build and create a vaccine from that and save the future and save humanity, or what's left of it. But then you could look at it also as if the insurance policy is, oh, she's the insurance policy, so her and her other rich uh people, her and her other rich not necessarily clientele, but the group of rich people, the entitled people in the future, will ensure that they have power over what's left of humanity, because the insurance policy is to prevent this original virus, this original form of the virus, from ever actually making it to the future, so there is no cure and there is no vaccine. You can interpret it that way too. Some people have also maybe interpreted it that maybe through the actions of what happened, then the past is saved too, as well as the future. But I don't really see how that could be the case, because this is dealing with the predestination theory. So it's one of those things where everything is predestined. So it doesn't make much sense in that mindset for that to actually work. Also, the guy opened the vial and let the virus out in the airport, so it's already in the air and it's already out there. So I don't buy that theory. So it's either one or two theories. It's they saved the future, or the future is still screwed and the screwed up status quo is maintained, and then the movie is just some bleak, depressing nightmare. It just depends on how you look at it. And I'm just never really been a big fan of ambiguous endings. And the thing is, Gilliam does this a lot. He even did this with Brazil. And I get it. It's an artistic sort of thing, but I don't know. I just prefer stories being final. Even when it comes to like a film, I prefer things being like, this is it, this is what happened, and this is the resolution. Like, this is the ending. There isn't another interpretation of it. They saved the future, and so on. And I guess you could look at it that way, but then there's this other stuff that just it's already kind of a bleak and gritty and dark film, so it really wouldn't be that far-fetched that it would continue to be a very bleak and dark ending, where the future, where the few rich and entitled have all the power, and the people who don't have anything are essentially left in cages and experimented on, and never have an opportunity to get up to the upper echelon. They're always these dregs. They're always essentially slaves to the rich and the powerful. It's something that you really could wrap your head around and think, like, why would these rich and powerful people in the future, even as messed up as this future is, give up all that power? You know what happens when people get power? It corrupts absolutely, so it doesn't really necessarily make that much sense when it comes to the tone of the film that they would go to this extra length and save the future and change the status quo. So the more I think about it, it's just one of those things. Yes, I could interpret it like it's the happy ending, but it doesn't make that much sense when it comes to the tone of the film. So that's why I just would have preferred if it was just the happy ending. That's it. The film was already bleak and depressing enough as it is. You don't need to have this ambiguous thing where it's like, oh, it could be an ending where everyone is screwed, and the future is history, but not in the way that you think. But despite that, I still do like the film, and I do like the script for the most part. I just think the ending wasn't as good as it could have been. Not necessarily because of the open ending, but really because of how it handled the Dr. Peters character and the initial release of the deadly virus. The film also features a really terrific and just spectacular cast. I mean, Bruce Willis and James Cole, easily one of his best and most standout performances. I mean, he really went all out here. Not only with his appearance, with the shaved head and everything, but he absolutely was willing to go the extra mile with this performance. It shows Bruce Willis in a light that you really did not see before. He's disheveled, he's unshaven, he's at times completely almost catatonic because he's on all these drugs and he's like drooling. He's a mess. And that's not the kind of appearance or the kind of character that you really saw Bruce Willis do much of prior to 12 Monkeys. It just showcased his range of acting and showed that he had another gear and he was firmly putting that into motion with his performance in this film. And Madeline Stowe, I also thought she did a marvelous job as Dr. Kathleen Rayleigh. I really liked the back and forth and the rapport between her and Bruce Willis. I thought they had some excellent chemistry. Brad Pitt was a lot of fun as Jeffrey Goins, this kooky son of a rich industrialist virus guy, Dr. Leland Goins, played by Christopher Plummer. David Morse, I mean, he, I guess, did the best he could with what he had to work with, but that character wasn't written very well, so I don't really have much to say about that guy. John Cena played Jose. You also had Christopher Maloney, who played the lieutenant. Frank Gorshin is in this as who played the Riddler in the 60s Batman show. He's in this as a doctor who works at the mental institution. But really the main players in this are Bruce Willis, Madeline Stowe, and Brad Pitt. And all three of them are amazing. Just really good performances by all three actors. The cinematography is by Roger Pratt, and I think the cinematography is definitely something that catches your eye. There's a lot of scenes in this movie that are really quite striking. There's a lot of moments where it looks very bleak, but at the same time very beautiful, like the shots of the abandoned mall that's all covered in cobwebs and dust, or when James goes outside in this plastic bubble suit and he's looking around at the ruins of what's left of a big city. I think it might have been New York. Just seeing the ruins of what's left. Actually, it's Baltimore. What's left of Baltimore or Philadelphia. And he looks up at one of the buildings, and there's a lion on top of the roof, and it roars. So there's some really nice looking visuals in this. The way that the future looked in terms of the griminess and the cages and the rich elite, and how they had all these different sort of steampunk kind of technology. That was definitely something that was intriguing visually. And even the sequences that take place in the 90s in Baltimore, they also had this very gritty and raw look to them. Yeah, it's a good looking film, and Roger Pratt did a great job with the cinematography. The film also features some nice editing by Mick Odsley. There's a lot of moments in this where things are kind of just jumping from one place to the next, and the editing really did capture that chaos and that feeling of unease and insanity, especially when it's trying to showcase some more insane personas, like what it's showing the scenes in the insane asylum. The music by Paul Buckmaster, I didn't mind the music, but it wasn't anything to me that was like that iconic. Like, it was interesting, and it had some notes where it definitely was quite something different. like the opening credits, for instance, or some other stuff like the climax or some of the other scenes throughout the movie. Uh, it really wasn't something, though, that I would listen to a whole lot. I really think that 12 Monkeys could have been even better if it had like a more accomplished or well-known composer who's doing the score. Like, I think it would have been interesting to see Carter Burwell and see what his take on a film like this would have been, or someone like, of course, Jerry Goldsmith, who's a legend, or Alan Silvestri, or James Horner. You know, just even maybe someone like John Debney, if he was still around. Um, I don't know. Like, the guy just didn't really seem like he was the most accomplished composer, and like he's worked with a lot of well-known people. Like, he worked with Elton John, and he's worked with David Bowie, and he's worked with a lot of other people. But it seems like he's more like a music guy. Like, he's a producer. Like, he did not really a guy who's done a lot of scores, and that kind of shows. Yeah, he did a lot more studio albums and worked with artists and things like that. But other than the score and those other elements that I talked about, the only other thing I can think of that's worth mentioning is maybe like the running time. I mean, it's like 129 minutes, but it doesn't really drag that much because I was very interested with the plot and how things were unfolding, and I wanted to see what was going to happen next. That's why the ending is so disappointing to me, because it just felt like it was just so easy. Well, the virus got released because uh, the there weren't really any extra protocols in place for a deadly virus, and airport security was run by a bunch of morons. And it's just one of those things where it's like, it kind of dampens the film a little bit. But I still like the movie. And I would definitely recommend 12 Monkeys if you haven't seen it yet. And yeah, I don't know what else to say except thanks for watching my rambling review of 12 Monkeys. And as always, I'll see you later. See ya.